What are some of the common pitfalls that you see startups encounter as they're trying to scale?
The one that's super overarching is really just that founder bottleneck. So frequently when a founder starts a company, I've personally found that a lot of the founders I work with are not necessarily the best at keeping their thoughts organized.
Founders sometimes, although they're well-intentioned, they don't get out of their own way and they actually bottleneck the success of their company. Welcome back to another episode of the Organized Chaos podcast. Today, we're diving into a topic that is really near and dear to my heart: building operational systems that actually work and help your company scale. My guest today is Katie Barnes. She is the founder of Rise and Optimize, and she's someone who has spent over 14 years in the trenches with startups and SaaS companies across industries like health, education, and legal technology. Katie has seen it all: the brilliant teams getting buried under bad processes, the systems held together by duct tape, and the inevitable operational breakdowns that can make or break a scaling company. Through her company, Rise and Optimize, Katie works as a fractional COO, and she helps early-stage companies move from reactive chaos to resilient and scalable operations. She's the person founders call when they need to build systems that support growth without burning out their teams. Today, we're going to explore Katie's journey as a founder, unpack the most common scaling pitfalls she's witnessed, and discover why hiring fractional executives might be the smartest move your growing company makes. Let's dive right into this conversation with Katie Barnes. Katie, welcome to the Organized Chaos podcast. Love having you here. I know I've been really excited for this one. For those who don't know you, I know that you spent 14 years maybe in working with startups and SaaS companies in different industries, different roles. I'd love if you could walk us through sort of your professional journey and what are maybe the pivotal moments that got you to decide, I want to start Rise and Optimize and start helping, SaaS companies grow in an optimal, streamlined fashion.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I think I can start with saying I decided that I'm a glutton for punishment, and that's why I end up with those very early stage startups. So yeah, I've been in the operator seat for a little over 14 years now in multiple different industries. So spent some time in health tech, legal, ed tech, a little bit of time in the art industry, which was an interesting take. Yeah, but I typically sit in that chief of staff role, a head of ops role. And even though I was going through all of these different types of industries, just kept seeing the same patterns popping up all over the place. There's different types of founder bottlenecks and some other things that I'm just seeing that it doesn't really matter what industry you're in, those things all cross over. So really decided after, about 14 years in actual full-time employment all the time that I wanted something that was a little bit more flexible to my schedule. I have a 2-year-old, so being able to sort of make my own hours was really nice. But then also I realized that as a fractional, I can bring all of that, all those years of experience in and hit the ground running and really offer the ability to help companies quickly and for a price that doesn't necessarily tank the runway.
No, that's great. And I mean, you mentioned a lot of tidbits here that I've actually recently spoke about with other guests and even other episodes is, yeah, startups, especially when they're scaling, there's a lot of room for doing it in a kind of haphazard, not structured manner, which is very inefficient, burns through your cash runway, and just causes all sorts of problems. But also, the fractional model is one that I'm seeing rise pretty significantly at the executive level, even in the HR space, in my space. The more, every time I talk to someone every week, there's this person telling me, you know what, I'm done with this full-time thing. There's just too much work. It's overload. It's not flexible for my life. Let me just jump into the fractional. So those are things that I can tell you I'm seeing. Not only you're not the first person telling me this. There's a lot of it's happening. But Katie, you mentioned something very interesting, and this is, a glutton for punishment. I think I'm one too, given the number of startups I've worked with over the years. And I love that you mentioned there's a lot of similarities with startups across industries. And from your experience, you've worked at a lot of them and you've done this pretty much as long as I have been doing this. What are some of the common pitfalls that you see startups encounter as they're trying to scale? And again, this can be anything from operational to leadership behavior. Anything that you see is common, I think, is interesting. So would love your take on that.
Sure. Yeah. I think across all fields, there's several that are like hit every time. I think like the one that's super overarching is really just that founder bottleneck. So frequently, when a founder starts a company, they're the ones that have all of that knowledge and they're the ones that obviously have so much passion for what they're doing. So it makes sense. But I've personally found that a lot of the founders I work with are not necessarily the best at keeping their thoughts organized, at least in like a written manner or a way that the rest of the team can follow. So the founder bottleneck is the one that I go back to all the time. I think that's like the most obvious one. But then really all of the other things sort of typically happen because of that, I would say. So, like messy handoffs, something that I really focus on in my work is looking at the entire prospect to client to renewal journey. And so frequently I see that the ball ends up getting dropped between that sales and CS handoff. So I would say that's a huge one. And then even like for that renewal, it sometimes falls off because there's just no clear pathway for who's supposed to be in charge of each thing. So accountability just gets sort of lost. I think like tools without owners, that kind of goes into that too. Like they tend to have a ton of different tools, especially right now with AI being so on the rise. There's a tool that can like magically fix everything for you. And of course, that's exciting and it sounds great, but you still need that human touch to have the accountability there and make sure that there's follow through on those tools. So I would say that's a huge one. And then finally, I think I would say like there's just no operating cadence overall. And I think that plays into all of these things as well. But they hit the ground running so fast and they have to be spry. And I understand that. And you definitely have to be ready to pivot. So I like to find that balance of being able to translate those founder ideas and the founder magic into something that's still somewhat of a system, but you can know that it's okay to change it. Like I think a lot of people get scared when you're like, I want to have SOPs or I want something in Notion. But I'm very big on like, we don't have to stick to this, but we need to have it written in some spot so that the team knows what to expect. Like transparency is kindness. Make sure they know what they're getting into.
No, those are some great points. I mean, and a lot of them tie together, right? Specifically, like the founder bottleneck. I see that a lot, and it's actually one point I've talked about recently as well, where founders sometimes, although they're well intentioned, they don't get out of their own way, and they actually bottleneck the success of their company by either things like hoarding decisions, messy handoffs, promoting a chaotic environment. And I love that you mentioned the structure behind things, and you mentioned things around process SOPs. Something I've noticed in my experience with founders as well, and just the startup ecosystem in general, is they mistake structure for rigidity. And something you pointed to, if there is structure, does not mean that we are locked into this. It means that we are aligned, that, hey, this is how we're going to do things. We're all on the same page. If for some reason we need to pivot, we at least are all starting from a common ground, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah.
like
Yeah. So
making sure, like, I just really truly believe, especially in startups, you're bringing in a lot of new employees, like younger employees that they really want that guidance. So it's again, it doesn't have to stay this way, but you can have all of those systems documented out so that you can set up those feedback loops and come in and check and see what's working. It's like mini growth experiments.
yeah, it's something I've seen also to that point is especially when and we're going to talk about growth stage, right? Companies, because that's kind of where a lot of the messy stuff starts happening. But when you're growing as an organization, you have a lot of people coming in, sometimes people leaving. If you don't have a structure for what you're doing and it's documented in some form, you've seen this as much as I do, I'm assuming, is things get messy pretty badly. You start having duplication. You have many different ways of running the same thing. You have issues with quality, issues with output, issues with accountability, issues with ownership. It becomes a spiraling mess. And if you don't fix it, as you continue to grow, it becomes worse and worse over time. In the HR world, I see it manifest in different ways, right? Processes break down, and the tendency for growing companies is to throw people at the problem, assuming that,
Right.
hey, we just need more hands on deck, which is another problem. You get into your cash runway, you go into layoff territory if your revenues don't hit. So there's a lot of problems that could happen there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's like, so those are like the super obvious big ones. But something interesting that I found in multiple of the startups that I have come into is that giant things like an invoicing or billing setup get lost in the mix of everything. And so like multiple times I've come in and done an audit on that like client life cycle and found over $30,000 of just ARR sitting there that was unbilled. And you can't go back and bill that because then you break the trust. So there's just so many little things. And that's why I like to really map out the entire life cycle, because maybe you're missing things there and that's really what's leading to the churn. Or, so many founders want to jump in and say, we have to increase ARR and we really need to get new users on board. And it's like, yeah, of course you do need that. But if you're leaking all of your users at the back end, then what difference is it going to make for those investors later if that's your
Yeah,
goal?
exactly. I mean, it's impacting your bottom line. None of this is good for you.
Exactly.
So, which leads me, Katie, into something that I mean, I think we can both agree here, and I think a lot of the listeners, I'm hoping all of them, but I'll say I'll never use all or none. So
No.
let's assume that mostly agree that you need some kind of structure, right? You need some kind of you know processes and so forth just to run the business in an efficient manner. Now, from your perspective, especially with companies that are scaling or are in the process of prepping to scale and grow, they're expecting some kind of growth spurt. How do you, in your opinion, or what kind of some actionable tips you have for them to start thinking of how to build processes in a manner that works for the organization, but also which manages work appropriately? It doesn't lead to burnout, because a lot of times growth spurts, they exert a lot of pressure on the team, and not only does it hurt their productivity, but also, I mean, when you burn out your workforce with unreasonable expectations, it also isn't a great place to be at. So, how do you try to balance between that growth and that need to scale, but also building something which gives companies processes that are manageable and they help them scale in a reasonable fashion?
Yeah, I think it's super important early on and really forever, but to make sure that your people feel heard and safe to share their opinions there. So I'm huge on, if you're setting up a process for a department, like do not let the founder just do that in their own little silo. Bring the stakeholders to the table so that they can have input there. And I think like you brought these people on because you trusted them, they're gritty, they can get their hands dirty. So bring them in, actually document those SOPs before, especially. So let's say once you raise, you're going to bring on a bunch of sales team members. Okay, we'll take that, whoever's leading sales, and bring them into the table, document the SOPs for that particular department. Even if it's like you're just literally talking to ChatGPT and like get like, here's what we typically do, just to have something there so that when they come in, the new hires come in, they're set up for a little bit more success. I also would very much argue to set up a 30, 60, 90-day success plan for those new people so that ahead of time, everybody knows what's expected. And again, it's startup world, so it's going to change for sure, but have a starting point, like you said, like start people on the same ground there. And I think that's like a huge stepping stone at the beginning. And then setting like weekly rhythms, I think can be really helpful too. So I write a lot about in my Substack about meetings just costing you way more than you
A lot.
realize. And yeah, I think you've had some people on that have discussed that as well. And there's people doing some really great things with technology to help that. But even just from without a technology perspective, bring your humans together and make sure that you have already looked at the agenda before the meeting started so that you're coming from a place where you can come in and actually be strategic instead of, a laggard and looking at what happened last week. Like you should be making moves and doing new things each week in a meeting. So I think there's so much potential there to have easy, actionable steps. Like clean meetings are amazing if you can find
Oh
them.
God, yeah. I mean, I recently had a common friend of ours, right, Christy from
Exactly.
Cairo, and we talked about meetings, and oh boy, she dropped a lot of some stats and stuff. I'm like, whoa, okay. I thought meetings were bad after that episode. I'm like, okay, meetings are the vein of our existence if we don't do them right.
You don't do
So
them right. I mean, like, they can be amazing, though, and again,
yes,
a theme that I always come back to in most of my writing and the way that I lead is that I just think people need to feel heard and valued and safe. So, set those meetings up so that they have their ownership of whatever piece of the meeting they're taking, And then that just ends up translating into better process and everything down the line too. Because if they feel accountable and heard, then they care about making that succeed.
No, I agree. And look, something I believe in is anything you do, especially at a growth stage startup where there's a lot happening, there's a lot of changes, a lot of pivoting. There has to be purpose behind it, and it has to be it has to be articulated very clearly, and not only in the founder's mind and the leadership's mind, but also across the organization. Because I mean, sometimes I feel that, or even see that growing companies tend to forget that there's such a small team where every person has an outsized impact on the organization,
Yes.
and a lot of times every single individual in that company owns a very valuable chunk of the organization's operation from end to end. Like if that person does not execute or doesn't have the right context, the ball's gonna be dropped, and it's gonna impact the business because they are an N of one handling an end to end process that no one else is involved in, nor do they have visibility in, which is also interesting. So I mean, I love that you brought up the seeking input from your team is so critical at all stages, because also it goes back to the trust. And a mistake I've seen also some founders make over the years is, as their company grows, they just don't pivot into thinking that, okay, it's time for me to delegate some of that decision making, or even include the team, as opposed to
Right.
having everything happen with me and stay with me. And a lot of times it's as simple as having a wake up conversation with a founder, like, hey, you've hired 20 people, very capable, and you hired them for a reason. Trust them to do what you're paying them to do.
Exactly.
Uh,
Yes.
right? That's really some great insight. But it all sounds so simple, but we see it so often in companies, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it is simple if you start with it early, especially because if you take that scenario and the founder sets up what success looks like for that employee before they even come in and onboard, then like essentially their ideas and thought process should be given to that employee. So trust them to be able to execute on that, you know?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great point. Katie, when you started off, you talked about the fractional element of your role and coming in. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's something I'm hearing a lot. It's something I've done a lot also myself. I often typically advise early stage founders, especially when they're growing early stages, to bring on fractional executives as they scale, because in my eyes, it gives them access to top tier talent that maybe they couldn't afford otherwise on a full time basis. And they can do that because this person isn't dedicating all of their time to that specific organization. They're quote unquote getting that top tier, expertise for a discount because they're spending less time and dedication to the organization. Of course, people are gonna say you have a biased view on this with this question. Like, do you think hiring fractional executives is valuable? But what are some pros and cons you see to that model? And maybe from your perspective, what is the inflection point for deciding whether, from your eyes, whether this is a fractional role versus this is something I should hand off now to a full timer?
Yeah, I think I am, of course, biased because I am a fractional. But the reason that I went out in fractional partially was that I worked with startups that were using them and saw the value and realized that, for a different, way better price and less overhead, you can get that senior level judgment for a fraction of the cost. And a lot of times, fractionals, they've already had the experience, so they can come in and hit the ground running way faster and they don't need that time. So you don't need me for 40 hours a week to be able to execute on the things that you need. I do think for me, the way that I work with a lot of clients is to come in and I never want to throw playbooks at any of my clients because yes, I've seen patterns in all these startups that are very similar, but every organization is its own entity for sure and like it's this own organism. So, and I'm like I said, very people oriented. So I think it gives this great ability to come in, get in under like fractional embedded at least, not necessarily just like a consultant that's, a
Yeah.
talking head, but the
Yes,
ability
that's a
to
good
come
point, actually.
in and really get a feel for the team and set them up with their own playbook. And then ideally, either at that point we decide, okay, here's this playbook for, somebody that hasn't had quite as much experience in operations, but can take this playbook and run with it and learn from that. Or, like I come in also during inflection points. So if someone has just raised or something and they need to do a bunch of hiring right away, like you can bring in a fractional for certain projects and sprint projects. So I think there's a lot of really valuable ways that founders can use fractionals. And so whether it's just a bridge to buy time or, and sometimes you end up in a gig where you're there for a very long time. I think you mentioned that you've had some contracts that are relatively
Oh
long.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it
I've
doesn't
had
have
the
to be
longest.
quick.
Yeah, the longest fractional I've ever done is 7 years long, which is kind of a long time,
Yeah.
right? Pretty long time. But again, I think you mentioned a very critical point here is that I see there's somewhat of a misconception of what fractional is.
Yeah.
And not only do I see that from founders, but just general population and general workforce. There is a misconception as to what a fractional person is versus a consultant. I think you sort of mentioned it beautifully, is that the typical consulting model is someone where I kind of categorize it into three: the do it yourself, do it with you, or do it for you, right?
Right.
Typical consultants are kind of do it yourself. They tell you what to do, but they don't get their hands dirty in helping you do it.
Right.
They give you the playbook, right? If you go and hire, let's say, a McKinsey, or
Right.
not necessarily that large of an organization, but even similar model of consulting, it's a do it yourself model. Basically, they tell you what you need to do, but ultimately you're accountable and responsible for executing. They have no stake in the execution of it, right?
Right.
Fractional is where the other two come in, right? It's either, if you want, and you mentioned the embedded, which I think is probably more on the far end, which is, right, we'll do it for you. Like, I'm integrated into your organization. I'm not necessarily working there 40 hours a week, but
Right.
I am there integrated with your workforce, and I'm actually doing the things that a typical full-timer might be doing. But given my higher level of expertise and experience, I can do this in a much more efficient manner and scale as you go, right? Um,
Exactly.
Whereas there's also that hybrid model of fractional where, if you already, let's say in my case, if you already have an HR team, right? I don't necessarily need to be doing it for you, but I can work with your team and help them build things. So yeah, I think that's an important distinction, because a lot of times, from my experience, founders and executives, they have this conception that a fractional executive is similar to the consulting model, the traditional consulting model, whereas, like, hey, they toss PowerPoint presentations at us and they tell us, God bless you, hope you make it on the other side, which is not necessarily what
Right.
you want, right?
Right. Yeah, and I actually work with some clients in an advisory capacity too, and I still think that's different than just
Yes.
consulting. So I certainly would still, in that case, don't necessarily embed with the team as much, but work a lot one-on-one with the founder. I don't think there'll ever be a time when I'll be able to not get my hands dirty with it. Like, I like to be in there and be able to really help make that change and make the difference.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've personally seen the value. The fractional, at least for me, that's worked the best is, what I like about the fractional model, and I always recommend executives to do it, even if they're not working with me directly. I'm like, hey, you need a fractional role for this position. Reason being is that, by design, it is temporary, and it is designed to help you scale and outgrow the fractional model,
Right.
right? The
Right.
goal, like, it's always part of the plan that you're going to get to a point where I'm going to help you build up your capabilities. It's I liken it to sort of, build, operate, transfer model, where I help you build, right, and then I transfer the knowledge to someone, right, and then I exit by transferring it completely over to you, which also helps. Like, by design, your priority as a fractional executive is to help that company scale and outgrow your services, right? But at the same time, also, to your point, if you're doing such a good job, they might want to keep you on board as an advisor or so forth. But again, it's still much better than having someone full time who necessarily you're not going to leverage their full capacity and get the bang for your buck.
Yeah, and I mean, it still also gives you that flexibility of, like, my minimum engagement is 3 months. So, like, you
Yes.
you don't have to lock in, and that's good for both sides because, if we don't get along, I don't wanna work with you either.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it has to be a win-win situation. Katie, this has been a very, insightful conversation. Loved all the tidbits you gave. So, for those folks who want to connect with you, learn more about what you do, how Rise and Optimize can help them scale, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is always an easy option, and then I've really found a new home on Substack. I love sharing ideas there, so I have a weekly newsletter that comes out and kind of really speaks about all of the leaks that I was talking about and that whole, prospect to client to renewal life cycle.
No, that's amazing. And I'll make sure to include all of those links in the description of the notes. So if anyone's interested, reach out to Katie on LinkedIn. through a website, newsletter. It's all going to be down in the links below. And I do recommend reaching out. I've had some great conversations with Katie offline, off the podcast. So I highly recommend it.
Yay. Yes, this has been great. Thanks so much for having me.
No, likewise. And thanks again for giving us all these amazing insights. I'm sure the listeners are going to enjoy it. And thanks again, Katie. Enjoy your day.
You too.